Caving is always a fun activity, but the fun gets sucked away when the walls begin to turn on you, and the depth begins to mess up your mental gyroscope and leaves you in a confused state. Here are a few stories where cavers met their final moments. This story takes us to the stunning coastline of Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula, where nature holds secrets beneath the surface. Deep underground lies Sistema Sac Acton, the longest underwater cave system in the world. Stretching over 368 kilometers, this labyrinth of tunnels and chambers is as breathtaking as it is treacherous. In December 2004, a group of 9 seasoned divers, their skills honed through years of underwater adventures, gathered to explore Tut Kimba. They were confident, almost invincible in their camaraderie, but the labyrinthine passages of Sac Acton were about to test them in ways they could never imagine. At the water's edge, the divers meticulously checked their gear, breathing regulators, air tanks, spools of rope, and brightly colored markers known as cookies, which were essential for navigation. In this underwater realm, visibility could drop to near nothing in moments, and every tool was a lifeline. The plan was simple. The team would split into 2 groups. Team A, led by an experienced guide, would descend first to lay down markers, ensuring a clear path. Team B would follow shortly after, retracing Team A's path to avoid getting lost. It was a straightforward dive, manageable even for beginners. Team A slipped into the water first, the crystal-clear entrance of Tut Kimba, giving way to the murky depths below. As they ventured deeper, the rhythmic sound of their breathing bubbles was the only break in the overwhelming silence. Following a permanent guideline, they carefully marked their path. The leader fixed a bright yellow marker at the first intersection, ensuring Team B would see it and follow the right path. Everything was going smoothly. Meanwhile, Team B entered the water and followed in Team A's footsteps. Reaching the first intersection, they saw the yellow marker, a reassuring sign that they were on track. But deep inside the cave, where darkness devours everything and each passage looks eerily similar, one mistake was all it took to spiral into chaos. 32 minutes into their dive, Team B reached the second marker. Here, they made a fateful error. Instead of turning right to follow the path leading back to the exit, they turned left. The tunnels all looked the same, and it was easy to misunderstand the directional markers. What seemed like a harmless mistake at first would soon become their worst nightmare. As they swam deeper into the system, the atmosphere changed. The cool confidence that had guided their movements was replaced by unease. The realization hit like a thunderclap. They were lost. 25 minutes after their wrong turn, they had traveled 1,400 feet deeper into the labyrinth, moving further away from safety. The water grew colder, and with every frantic movement, they stirred up fine silt, reducing visibility to almost nothing. The disorienting fog blurred their perception of up, down, and sideways. Panic was setting in. At the surface, Team A had completed their dive. They were relieved and began removing the markers they had placed. What they didn't know was that Team B was still inside, lost and moving further into the dark maze of the cave. Team B, deep in the labyrinth, stopped at an intersection and realized their mistake. It hit them like a cold wave. They had taken the wrong turn. One diver quickly unspooled a rope, desperately searching for another guideline to lead them back. But there was nothing, only the looming shadows of the cave walls. Time was slipping away, and so was their air supply. The group began to panic. They decided to split into 2 pairs, thinking it would give them a better chance to find their way out. The lead pair swam ahead, their movements frantic as they tried to spot the markers they had passed earlier. But when they reached the intersection where they had made the wrong turn, their hearts sank. There were no markers, no signs of a path back to safety, just endless, suffocating darkness. With their air tanks depleting rapidly, their situation became critical. One diver's air was almost gone. He had no choice but to buddy breathe with his partner, sharing the dwindling supply of air. Every moment felt heavier as their hopes started to fade. Meanwhile, at the surface, Team A began to sense that something was wrong. Too much time had passed, and there was no sign of Team B. The guide and a few others quickly grabbed extra tanks and dove back into the water. Their hearts were pounding as they swam deeper, calling on every ounce of skill and speed to locate their missing teammates. It didn't take long to find the first pair. They were only 250 feet from the surface, but they were barely alive. Their air tanks were almost empty, and they were struggling to breathe. The rescuers pulled them to safety, their relief mixed with urgency. 2 more divers were still missing. The rescued pair, gasping for air, explained they had seen the lights of their teammates not far behind. But minutes passed, stretching into agonizing moments, and the missing pair still didn't appear. The rescuers knew they had no time to lose. They dove deeper, pushing further into the cave despite the growing tension in their chests. Then their flashlights caught a chilling sight. Suspended near the ceiling of the cave were the last 2 divers, motionless. Their regulators floated beside them, useless now. The rescuers approached slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down like the water around them. They gently retrieved the bodies and brought them back to the surface. When they checked the tanks, their fears were confirmed. The tanks were completely empty. The divers had run out of air, trapped in the place they had come to explore. The Sistema Sac Acton cave system is both beautiful and deadly. Its winding passages and silent depths draw explorers from around the world, but it demands respect and caution. For Team B, a single wrong turn led to a cascade of tragic events. The second story happened in March 1997. 2 friends, Andrew and Attila, planned a caving expedition. Excitement buzzed between them as they imagined the thrill of descending the notorious 160-foot entrance pit. On the morning of March 18th, the sky was overcast, and a steady drizzle accompanied their approach to the cave. As they neared the entrance, the roar of water cascading into the pit greeted them, louder and more menacing than expected. Despite the biting cold and the intensifying rain, neither thought to retrieve the wetsuits left in the car. This decision, seemingly minor, would prove to be one of many critical mistakes. Ignoring the warning signs, they pressed on. The thrill of the descent clouded their judgment, and the sheer force of the waterfall did little to deter their excitement or their arrogance. They rigged their ropes directly in the waterfall's path, fully aware they would get wet, but underestimating how quickly the cold would seep into their bones. Attila, eager and rushed, had left his helmet behind, another oversight that would later haunt them. Andrew descended first, the icy water pounding his back as he slid deeper into the abyss. The waterfall was merciless, a frigid torrent that soaked him to the core by the time he reached the bottom. Attila gripped the rope, his gloves slick with moisture, and began his descent. The water lashed against him, each drop like a shard of ice, making every movement a struggle. Inside the cave, the air was thick and damp. The faint beams of their headlamps illuminated walls glistening with moisture. Barely 30 minutes into their exploration, Attila began to tremble, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. His body was succumbing to the icy grip of the cave. He called out to Andrew, his voice weak and strained, saying he couldn't stay down there any longer. He moved to ready the ropes for their ascent, his own hands stiffening from the cold. Unfortunately, the cow's tail was far too long, a dangerous oversight. He also relied on a Petzl shunt as a backup safety device, but its placement and usage were far from ideal. Before he could say anything, Attila was already on the rope, beginning his ascent. Each movement was a battle. The freezing water streamed over him, soaking his gear and making the rope feel slick and unsteady. The relentless pounding of the waterfall slowed his progress, draining his strength with every inch gained. Halfway up the ascent, Attila's struggle intensified. Each pull felt heavier, each grip more tenuous. He was shivering uncontrollably now, his muscles rebelling against the cold. The strap stretched so far that he could not even reach the ascender to fix it. He shouted for Andrew, but the roaring waterfall swallowed his voice, drowning it in the relentless noise. Andrew could barely hear Attila's cries through the crashing water. He shouted for Attila to come back down, but Attila could not respond clearly. Then, Andrew heard him clearly for the first time. Attila called out, his voice faint and desperate. He was stuck and could not move. Andrew's heart raced. His friend was trapped in the middle of the waterfall with no way to free himself. Knowing how serious the situation had become, Andrew moved quickly. He clipped himself into the rope and began climbing toward Attila. The ascent was brutal. Every foot Andrew gained felt like a small victory as the freezing water poured over him, stealing his warmth and numbing his hands. When Andrew reached Attila, the sight was grim. Attila hung limply in his harness. He was still conscious but unable to move. His body was nearly paralyzed by the cold, and hypothermia had already taken hold. Attila's shivering was uncontrollable. His skin was pale, and his movements were slow and weak. Andrew knew there was no time to waste. Andrew decided to perform a pick-off rescue. This maneuver required him to attach Attila to his own harness and descend with him to the ground. It was a technique Andrew had learned in training, but the roaring waterfall and their freezing bodies made this far more difficult than anything he had practiced before. Desperate, Andrew decided to try another approach. He tethered Attila to himself and attempted to climb out, hoping to pull them both to safety. The added weight made the task nearly impossible. He ascended about 15 feet, each movement a monumental struggle, before his strength gave out. His body trembled violently, and he could go no further. In a last act of determination, Andrew swung himself toward a nearby ledge. The effort drained him completely, but he managed to pull himself onto the ledge. Collapsing onto the cold, wet rock, his body convulsed from the cold. His soaked clothes offered no protection. Crawling to a slightly drier spot, Andrew's vision blurred, and he blacked out. When Andrew regained consciousness, hours had passed. His body was stiff and numb, his mind foggy and disoriented. The moment he opened his eyes, the reality of the situation came crashing down on him. He saw Attila, still hanging in the waterfall, motionless. With a heavy heart, he severed the tether that connected him to Attila. It was clear that his friend was gone. Andrew began the agonizing climb out of the cave alone. Every step felt heavier than the last. His body was weak, and the weight of what had happened pressed down on him. Somehow, he made it to the surface. Looking back, it was clear that mistakes had been made from the very beginning. Leaving their wetsuits behind, Attila's unsafe climbing gear, and their lack of experience with wet, vertical caves all contributed to the tragedy. The cave had taken more than just their confidence. It had claimed Attila's life, and for Andrew, it left a scar that would never heal. The roar of the waterfall, once an exciting challenge, now echoed in Andrew's memory as a haunting reminder of what they had lost. The last story speaks not of one life at risk, but 19. On a freezing January morning in 1970, a group of 31 adventurers gathered, their breath visible in the icy air. They stood wrapped in layers of clothing, bracing themselves against the biting cold. With each step through the snow-covered forest, the crunch underfoot echoed like whispers of what lay ahead. Their destination was Knox Cave, a place infamous for its treacherous challenge, the Gun Barrel. The Gun Barrel was not just a narrow tunnel, it was a test of courage and resilience. Shaped like a keyhole, it measured a mere 18 inches in width and stretched 60 feet into darkness. For the group, the challenge promised more than bragging rights. Beyond the gun barrel lay untouched sections of the cave, a tantalizing reward for their bravery. The journey to the cave was uneventful, but filled with quiet anticipation. Snow blanketed the forest, muffling the world around them. When they reached the cave's entrance, it appeared as a gaping sinkhole, its mouth covered in snow, an ominous portal into the earth. Inside, the temperature plummeted, and the air grew damp and heavy. The only sounds were the steady dripping of water and the shuffle of boots against stone. 19 members of the group decided to take on the gun barrel, including 14-year-old Peter Venz. This was Peter's first caving expedition, and he was determined to prove his courage. Peter watched the others enter the tunnel ahead of him. Some crawled swiftly, their movements confident, while others hesitated, each inch forward marked by uncertainty. When his turn came, Peter steeled himself and pushed forward into the tight passage. The tunnel was unlike anything Peter had imagined. The walls pressed against him, jagged and unforgiving, scraping his skin as he wriggled forward. Every movement was a struggle, his elbows and knees bearing the brunt of the rough surface. The air grew thin, each breath shallow and strained. The darkness seemed to close in around him, the rock feeling heavier with every inch. Peter was just 8 feet from the exit when disaster struck. His knee slipped into a narrow crevice in the floor. At first, he thought it was a minor inconvenience, something he could quickly fix. He tried to pull his leg free, but it would not budge. He twisted, yanked, and strained, but the rock held him fast. Panic set in, his breathing quickening as he realized he was stuck. He called out for help, his voice shaking. Ahead, the others had no idea what had happened. They continued crawling until the absence of Peter's voice made them stop. Shouts echoed back through the tunnel as they called to him. When Peter explained that he was trapped, the group turned around, but their situation quickly became clear. Peter's body blocked the narrow tunnel completely. No one could move forward or backward. The group was trapped. They tried everything to free him. They pulled on his leg, twisted his body, and shifted him in every direction they could think of, but nothing worked. Each attempt caused Peter to cry out in pain, forcing them to stop. As time dragged on, the cold of the cave began to seep into their bodies. They huddled together for warmth, the narrow space forcing them into uncomfortable positions. Fear gnawed at the younger members of the group, especially Peter, while the older cavers tried to maintain a sense of calm. Meanwhile, the remaining members of the expedition, waiting outside the cave, grew increasingly worried. Hours had passed with no sign of the others. Something was clearly wrong. One of them decided to enter the cave to investigate. When they reached the gun barrel, they were horrified to find Peter stuck and the others trapped behind him. They rushed back to the surface and raised the alarm. By the time rescuers arrived, it was late afternoon. Police and firefighters assessed the situation, but the narrowness of the gun barrel posed a significant challenge. They could not simply pull Peter free without risking severe injury. Hours passed as they tried various methods, but nothing worked. Inside the cave, the situation grew dire. Peter's mental state began to deteriorate. Fear and exhaustion took their toll, and he started to hallucinate. At one point, he screamed about a snake biting him, though there was nothing there. His cries echoed through the tunnel, chilling the group trapped behind him. The temperature inside the cave continued to drop. Hypothermia became a real and pressing danger. The rescuers outside grew increasingly desperate, knowing that time was running out. Finally, around 8:30 p.m., after countless failed attempts, they devised a new plan. The rescuers handed a thermos of soapy water down to the group. They hoped the slippery liquid would help free Peter's knee. Carefully, they poured the soapy water around his leg, soaking the area. A rope was tied around Peter's ankle, and the rescuers coordinated with the group inside the cave. Slowly, they began to pull. The rescuers outside tugged gently on the rope, while those inside wriggled beside Peter to ease the pressure on his knee. For a long time, there was no movement. The tension was unbearable. Then, finally, Peter's knee began to shift. With one last careful pull, his leg popped free from the crevice. Relief swept through everyone, but the danger was not over. Peter was still in a precarious position. Inch by inch, they guided him out of the tight passage. Every movement was painstakingly slow, but eventually, Peter emerged from the tunnel. The group trapped behind him followed, crawling out one by one, their exhaustion evident in every step. Peter's ordeal left him with fractured bones and severe bruising on his leg. He was also treated for hypothermia, but recovered fully after a few days. The experience left scars on all involved, both physical and emotional. Knox Cave's gun barrel had tested them in ways they had never imagined. It was a harrowing reminder of the dangers that come with seeking adventure in the unknown. The echoes of that day, the scrape of rock against skin, the cries for help, and the suffocating weight of the stone, lingered in their minds long after they returned to the surface. It was a tale of survival, but also a warning of how quickly bravery can turn into tragedy.